One of the things I've noticed in my fourth term here is that this legislature can be wildly inconsistent. Inconsistent in the principles it claims to value and cherish, inconsistent in our actions on this floor at times. For as long as I've been here, last 8 years or so, we've heard a lot on this floor and a lot in this building about the need to exercise states' rights, the need to push back against an oppressive federal government and fight back against federal overreach of all form and fashion. But what do we have here today? We have Senate Bill 4. A bill that essentially federalizes local law enforcement throughout the state of Texas. I've been in contact with law enforcement agencies in my district, and I'll tell you that the Arlington Police Department, as virtually every law enforcement agency in the state does, cooperates with ICE voluntarily. They honor detainer requests. But they don't support this bill. And I'm going to read the letter from our police chief, or read an excerpt from a letter from our police chief. It says, SB 4, as it is currently written, and that was before the amendments, raises constitutional concerns. The Fourth Amendment of the United States Constitution, Article 1, Section 9 of the Texas Constitution, afford individuals the right to be free from unreasonable seizure. Courts have long held that the Constitution requires probable cause for an arrest or lengthy detention. Many courts have held that the probable cause must be for a criminal violation. However, SB 4 disregards these Fourth Amendment concerns by requiring law enforcement agencies to presume the existence of probable cause simply because a federal agent wants an individual detained, blindly comply with a federal request to deprive a person of their liberty when the justification for the request hasn't been reviewed by a judge, and continue to detain an individual based upon a document which specifically states that it should not impact decisions about an individual's release. Furthermore, we know that ICE, believe it or not, gets it wrong sometimes. Members, do you know that ICE has issued detainers for United States citizens? It's happened before, and it could happen again. And if it happens again under SB 4, we will have U.S. citizens detained indefinitely in Texas prisons until ICE comes and picks them up. And members, I'm guessing some of you also didn't know that, as I didn't know until very recently, that if let's say I'm arrested, or there's an arrest warrant issued for me in Grand Prairie, the city I live in, and I'm picked up in Arlington and put in jail there. And keep in mind, this would be a criminal warrant for my arrest. Arlington will hold me till Grand Prairie comes and gets me, but they'll hold me for 72 hours, and they'll let me go. That's with a criminal warrant. There's no criminal warrant called for in this bill. This is simply a detainer. And as we try today to change it to a criminal warrant, we weren't able to do that. So think about the inconsistency of that policy. And think about the terrible position we are putting law enforcement officers across our state, the men and the women who protect our communities, protect our homes, protect our families, the terrible position we are putting them in by destroying the trust that they have worked so hard to build up with the communities they are charged with protecting. And so when I think about those constitutional concerns, I can't help but be reminded of how inconsistent we are, because we hear a lot about liberty, we hear a lot about the Constitution and traditional constitutional principles, and then we turn it on its head with a bill like this. Speaking of the Constitution, since we've been in session this year, federal courts have ruled not once, not twice, but 3 times that this legislature has systematically and intentionally discriminated against African American and Latino voters in this state. And before someone objects and says that's not relevant to the bill, I'm going to draw a straight line from those rulings to this bill here today. And I'll talk just specifically about the State House ruling. I won't even talk about the congressional or the voter ID ruling. The State House ruling that came out last week, the impact of the plan was certainly to reduce minority voting opportunities statewide, resulting in even less proportional representation for minority voters. Map drawers' discussions demonstrated a hostility towards creating minority-controlled districts despite their massive population growth. Map drawers' use of race in the name of the Voting Rights Act compliance turned the Voting Rights Act on its head. Instead of using race to provide equal electoral opportunity, they intentionally used it to undermine Latino voting opportunity. And so how is that relevant to what we're talking about here today? Because those maps, those intentionally discriminatory maps, they do what the judges said. They result in less elected officials being elected who are responsive to Latino citizens and African American citizens in our state. There are fewer seats in this House where minority voters have their voices heard on this floor. And as a result, this is what we get. We get Senate Bill 4 as a result of those maps. And so it's a vicious cycle. It's a vicious cycle. Produce discriminatory maps, limit minority influence in the state, produce horrible policy that in turn punishes those very same people. And it's not just this bill. It could be public education funding cuts. It could be health care funding cuts, a variety of other things we could talk about. But that's the result of that kind of intentional discrimination. So instead of trying to figure out how we're going to fix those maps, fix that voter ID law that's so flawed, what are we doing? We're passing yet another bill that discriminates against millions of Texans.